and welcome to Our Time. Martin Hamilton Smith uses the lens of a life spent as a soldier, a businessman and a politician to interpret the rise and fall of 7 South Australian leaders over 30 turbulent years. It's a history of statesmanship, honour and duty, high ideals, aspiration and outstanding political success. It's also a story of failure, dashed hopes, betrayal, scheming and deception. And here is the man himself, Martin Hamilton Smith. Welcome, Martin.
Great to be with you, Malcolm.
Now, listen, now all the politicians say great to be with you. Is it really?
No, of course it is. It's always great to be talking about the history of South Australian politics. There's plenty to tell.
Well, that's different. That's different because it's usually some new scheme or some vote-grabbing 3-second grab that you come up with. How did you cope with that while you're in politics? Just by the way, when whatever you say, you know somebody's going to take the thing you didn't want said.
Yeah. Look, trying to compress, what should be said in 10 minutes down into a sort of 5-second news grab is always a challenge, and you're constantly misrepresented, you're constantly taken off at a tangent, you're constantly confused by the media. But the interaction between the media and politics is really what's changed politics for better and for worse in recent years, and it's an interesting dynamic.
Very much, because everyone's after that, 3-second grab of something that's going to be controversial.
Well, gone are the days, when I first became an MP, I went down to the bowels of Parliament House to the library and I pulled out the newspapers from 1896 when politics was reported in so politely in the newspaper.
Yeah.
Now, of course, there's social media, there's televisions, there's radios, everyone's crawling over you. They all need an angle.
Yeah.
And of course, that's turned politics into something of a football game.
Hasn't it though? The respect has gone.
Well, look, the media now want blood. They want a football game. There's got to be a winner and a loser every week. There's got to be casualties carried off the paddock. Who succeeded and who failed today? Good news doesn't sell. Bad news does.
That's true.
Bad news does. So all the media are crawling over the political scene, trying to find out: did he tell the truth? Did he stretch the truth? Is he gone? Is he going to be here next week? This just goes on endlessly, and it's very hard for politicians to wade through that nonsense and stay on message.
Yeah, not only that, but clearly it's an early start for everybody, because when you think the morning TV programs and radio programs, starting at 7 o'clock, there's politicians fronting up for whatever the favourite topic that day is going to be.
Well,
I'm amazed.
I talk about this in the book quite a bit. In a way, political parties have hijacked our democracy. They're not mentioned in the Constitution, by the way, the Australian Constitution or the South Australian Constitution.
Interesting.
That's true in the United States as well. And yet people think that the Liberal Party, the Labor Party, the Greens, in the United States, the Democrats and the Republicans are all part of our democracy. That's not true. They came along later, and they realised by grouping up they could hijack the system. They have. And of course that's added to the sense of it being combative, because you've got this gladiatorial spectacle now that must unfold every week to please the media. And of course in the context of all that, people get confused, at times disappointed. It can all be so awfully cynical. There are some high moments in politics where people are doing really good work, and often that gets spoiled by the need to present some petty headline and dumb something down into language that the lowest form of media can understand and regurgitate. It's quite a worry, actually.
Well, first of all, each party can't be doing the wrong thing, but the other party is constantly accusing them of doing exactly that. That's how it seems to the viewer or observer. And it just becomes very frustrating, because you think, are you actually working for the country, or are you working for a party to promote yourself to stay in business?
Yeah, well, you've nailed the central theme of my book, and that is that I think the parties often work in their own self-interest and not in the interests of the nation. And of course, to do that, you've got to demonise the other party. They've got to be the most terrible people that have ever walked on the planet.
Yes.
And of course, your party is holier than thou.
Yes.
And I give plenty of examples of this in the book.
Well,
I'd like to see a little bit more collegiate cooperation and a little less confrontation.
Wouldn't that be good? Look, we've known about this book for a while, because each time I've talked to you over the last few years, we've actually mentioned he's writing writing a book, and this is the book. Why did you call it Seven Leaders in Camelot? And could I answer that because South Australia or Adelaide itself is Camelot?
Well, it's been described as Camelot on the Torrens. It was a grand experiment, remember? We didn't have
Yes.
convicts. This
Now-
was going to be
Yes,
the
go
dream
back. Yes, go back a tick because I'm fascinated with language and the way we speak because we've got a more open English way of speaking here. And it was only recently reading a book on Muriel Matters that I completely understood why South Australians have the accent we have and the eastern states have theirs. Sorry, but politics were the same.
Well, we were always meant to be something fresh, something different, and something
Utopia.
new. And the 7 leaders I wrote about are the 6 premiers I worked with, and myself as opposition leader. I describe myself as the least successful. I think that's a pretty accurate comment. But most people write a political memoir, it's all about them. When I sat down to think about this, I didn't want to write that sort of a book. I wanted to write a book about the 6 premiers I'd worked with because their rise and fall tells a story. Sometimes it's an heroic story, other times it's quite a tragic story. There's lessons for aspiring political candidates, for staffers, for media and journalists in particular. This is a must read because it really gives them the inside scoop about how politicians deal with the media. And I thought that would be a more interesting story in the way of leaving behind something that was useful because I wanted people to understand these 30 years. You know, this story of South Australia since the Dean Brown election in 1993 through to when I left in 2018. Honestly, you could make a Netflix movie about this and it would, if it was filmed in Washington or London, it'd be a bestseller.
Bestseller, yeah.
You have all the cut, the thrust, the loyalty, the disloyalty, you know, the bad behaviours, the good behaviour. You've got it all. It just happened to be in Adelaide, and in that respect, it's a little case study of what's gone wrong. Really, what's gone wrong with Western politics and democracy as we know it, and what we need to do to fix it. And that's the sort of thing I wanted to leave behind for those who follow on.
I think it's very unfortunate you've never had a go as the Premier here, to be frank, because I've known you for such a long time and I understand that you are a very honourable man. And I think it was very unfortunate, but you did something incredibly courageous. You were originally standing with the Liberal Party, and because, as you have said, it all became a bit stagnant with infighting and old guard and new guard, you made the decision to become an independent, crossed the floor and became a Labor, not a Labor minister, an independent minister
right.
in the Labor government. But you are the one who foresaw the advantage of building around the Torrens, around our river, which is now occurring more and more. And why didn't they pursue that with you? That was weird for me.
Well, look, I joined the Liberal Party in 1993 because that was the party I felt my values most aligned with.
But also your family were more or less, your mum very strong.
Sure. But as I got involved, you know, the dumping of Dean Brown, the Dean Brown government by the Olsen government and its supporters, then the undermining of the Olsen government, then the hurling of the Liberal Party into opposition for 16 years, the supremacy of the Rann and Wetherell governments. I mean, the Liberal Party that I was part of was just pathetic. Not only that, it was toxic. The relationships were toxic. Now, most people that find themselves in a toxic workplace leave it. And in the end, I decided, frankly, I'd gotten involved in politics to try and make my country and my state a better place, not to bat away for a political party that seemed to want to rip itself to pieces every tick of the clock.
And still,
so in the end, yes, exactly. I resigned from the Liberal Party and became an independent. Within a nanosecond, the Labor government offered me a role as an independent Liberal in their government. I struggled for reasons not to accept it, and I did accept it, and that was where I was able to finally do some good work. And I think getting Adelaide Oval built, saving the submarines for Australian shipyards and Australian workers, and rebuilding our trade and investment agenda are 3 things that
something
I feel...
that's not been mentioned lately, sadly.
Yeah, I feel we really kicked some goals, and I actually left at a time of my own choosing, feeling that I'd actually done something constructive for the state I love so much. So not everyone gets to do that, and you know, I didn't really have too many axes to grind. I'd worked with some unpleasant people, but I'd worked with some very pleasant people. And the last 4 years, actually, working in the Wetherell government were the highlight because I actually got to work with a group of people who actually got along with each other.
And
it was
wanted
really
to
nice.
achieve.
And achieve things, yes.
Yeah.
It was really nice, actually, a lovely group of
Yeah.
people. And I got to realise that a lot of the argy-bargy that goes from both sides, there's good people and bad people on both sides. And you need to wade through the political party nonsense and find out where those good people are and vote for them, regardless of what side they're on.
Look, I couldn't agree with you more. And one of the interesting things, having hosted this program now for 13 years, is I've talked to a few politicians, but most of them are afraid to come on because they think it's going to be a getcha.
Oh.
And the reality is, because of being able to talk to people like you and Francis Bedford, and there's been a couple of others who literally have helped save community television, hearing more about them and what their values are in life, to me, makes it more attractive to vote for them. I just wish more would come on so that we could have an honest discussion about who are you?
Yeah, well, look,
you know?
I think as a retired politician, it's part of the reason I wrote the book, you can actually make a contribution about how to improve our politics.
Right.
Because you're sort of out of it. It's over.
Yes, yes.
You don't have to be nice to anyone.
And you don't have to
pretend.
Your line.
You're not having to keep a group of people in a tent. And so I've felt the need to sort of share my views in the hope of making our politics better, because Australia and South Australia are worth it, but if we don't look after it and nurture this thing, our democracy, we'll lose it. And I wouldn't like to see that happen.
All right, we're going to take a short break, but when we come back, I want to talk about your background because it's fascinating, and we'll have a bit of comment about what's happening in the Middle East as well. That's after this. Welcome back. We're talking with Martin Hamilton Smith, ex-politician and writer of this book called That. But inside, Martin, there's something fascinating. There's pictures. I've always loved pictures in a book. But this top photo here is something that I haven't done but would love to do, is jumping out a plane. Why did you do that?
Well, the Air Force argued that all of us that jumped out of aeroplanes had, departed our senses. They thought we were perfectly mad jumping out of a serviceable aircraft. But look, I was the commanding officer of a regiment of Special Forces. I spent most of my time in the Special Air Service Regiment and the Commando Regiment. I'm still the national chairman of the Veterans Organisation for the SAS. And our job was to insert behind the enemy lines and mess them up. And one of the ways we did that was jumping out of aeroplanes. I was a free-fall parachute instructor, along with many other skills. But, our ADF is out there doing dangerous things all the time, getting ready to protect us. And they've been called on during 2 world wars to do just that.
Yes.
And that's what we're there for.
Extraordinary, really. But your background is really quite extraordinary. So you obviously went to school as a kid, but then from school you went?
Straight to the Royal Military College Duntroon as a 17-year-old. And I graduated from there to an infantry battalion, the 6th Battalion, and found myself in Malaysia on operations commanding a platoon of troops. You grow up quickly when you're a 22-year-old in command of a group
How much
of men.
training did you have before that?
4 years.
Okay.
4 years of pretty solid training. I'd been in the Army Reserve for 12 to 18 months prior to that as well. So
Was
I had
there
a fair
a
bit of training.
family link to the Army?
My grandfather was a Rat of Tobruk. He had a big influence on me, and both grandfathers served in the World Wars.
Yeah, right.
And,
Did you feel like a family need to continue that, or is there something inside?
Not particularly. I was one of those kids that decided when I was 12 what I wanted to do. The Vietnam War was raging. I picked a lot of that up on television and just watching the news.
First war we had on television.
And I just decided at the age of 12 I wanted to be an officer in the Army, and then I set about becoming one. So it helped me get through school. It's a good idea to sort of think about it at that age. And I finished up in selecting for the Special Air Service Regiment, and the rest of my career was spent dealing at the sharp edge of Special Forces up to the rank of Colonel.
How long were you in Egypt for?
I commanded our peacekeepers in 1993 for a year on the Sinai, right near Gaza, where all the action is at the moment. And it was quite soul-destroying. And I lived in the desert there for a year. We'd patrol the border. We tried to keep Israel and Egypt from rekindling another war. But you'd go through Gaza at the Rafah crossing all the time. I lived and worked in Israel and Egypt quite a bit. I got to mix with a lot of Israelis and a lot of Palestinians. you realise the intractable nature of that conflict. And
It's an
I
old
see what's
conflict.
going on now, and it just breaks my heart.
Yeah, it's an old conflict though, isn't it? This has been going on for literally centuries.
It is an old conflict, and people don't seem to want to solve it. You know,
Interesting that, isn't it?
well, you've got people on both sides who refuse to accept the other side's right to exist, and it's very hard. It's very hard to resolve something if you don't accept the other party's right to exist.
Quite. And where do you feel that started?
Well, it depends who you speak to. History is full of different versions. If you talk to us, to really understand the problem, I think you've got to sit down with Palestinians and Jewish Israeli people separately and go through their respective histories. You'll get two completely different stories, and somewhere in between is the truth. Trying to understand it impartially, good luck with that, because it's so emotional. And
is it emotional because it's based on religious beliefs?
Well, I'm not sure if it is based on religious belief. I think it's partly to do with religion, it's partly to do with culture, it's partly to do with economics, it's partly to do with water, it's partly to do with who owns land and property. It's to do with so many things. It's not just about religion at all, really.
Did it more or less start, though, with Abraham and that family initially?
You'll certainly find a version of history that tells you it goes right back to who owned the land in the first place.
Right.
And of course, we're used to that conversation with the Indigenous conversation in our nation. You know, who came first is important. People have their own version of who came first. Probably none of them,
actually.
But you know, at some point, common sense has to prevail. You know, we know the story. Palestinians lived there reasonably peacefully around the time of, World War I and in the interwar years. After the Second World War, there was a huge influx of terribly displaced and awfully treated people fleeing Nazi persecution. And, one group were farmers, the other group were shepherds, and it's broken down from there on in, and they're trying to work out how to share the land. Well, it's pretty ruthless, and they need to reach an agreement. They need to start working together on a solution.
Absolutely, but truthfully, the land isn't that fabulous. There's a lot of desert there.
No, I've stood on the border at Rafah, and on one side, the Israeli side, they're growing tomatoes, and on the other side, a metre away, it's sand. You can pick it up and drift it through your hands. How you manage the water, how you manage the land is crucially important. I think the Israelis generally have put the land to good use. The Palestinians have a slightly different economic model. This was originally Lawrence of Arabia country. Yes. It was full of Bedouin.
I've been there. I was there last year.
You know the contrasts and the things that are ripping the place apart as well as putting it back together again.
Yeah.
Well, I would say, though, they're only going to get a solution if people start thinking about future generations and stop thinking about the past.
Well, that's interesting because a lot of people don't want to accept history. They don't want to look backwards, but you can't look forwards until you know where you've come from. And it strikes me that if you look back at the history, you can see that there's bloodshed been going on for quite some time. And it's like, do we want to keep living like this or don't we?
And of course, look, any solution that sees every Jewish person being driven out of the land into the Mediterranean to swim for it, or alternatively, any solution that sees Palestinians permanently dislodged from the land they own for centuries isn't going to rub. Right? Any solution that sees one side or the other wiped out is not going to happen. And of course, we saw what happened on October 7th with those awful attacks against those innocent Israeli people. We've now seen the consequence of that, which is equally violent and awful in Gaza. And at some point, the parties are going to have to sit down and recognise they need to find a way to live together and share the land. And until they do and genuinely accept each other's right to exist, there's not going to be peace.
Having been a politician, you must have an awareness of how difficult it is to get people to come together on anything when you've got two opposing views.
Well, it's an interesting perspective, that of a soldier, which is very strategic and military focused, and that of a politician, which is quite different. And I see both perspectives at play in the Middle East. There will be war, as Clausewitz once said, is the extension of politics by other means. It's not the other way around. So at the core of the fighting are political problems, and those political problems need a solution. And that's going to require a lot of courage from leaders on both sides. You know, Israeli and Palestinian leaders might have to have the courage to stand up and look at their people in the eye and say, I'm going to cut a deal. I'm going to cut a deal with the other side. Because it's very easy to look at your own people and say, no, we'll never accept their right to exist. But as long as you do that, you don't solve the problem.
But the people are starting to rise against that. That's what appears to be happening now. So common sense, it seems to prevail within the population, but not the leaders.
Yeah, I hope so. The whole region needs new leadership on all sides. And you are right. It breaks my heart to see the Palestinian people being used as human shields, in effect, to you know, save the bombs from striking Hamas. It breaks your heart to see people used like that.
Yeah.
But equally, you know, there are Israelis that are being thrown into the fire.
Exactly.
So it works on both sides.
ways.
But the people on both sides are going to have to stand up, grab their leaders, smash some heads together and demand a peaceful resolution, because they've been so close 2 or 3 times. When I was there after the Camp David Accords, you know, it was a period when we were very close. Since then, we've lost our way several times. It's time for ordinary mums and dads and families, I think, on both the Palestinian and the Israeli side to grab their leaders and say, look, enough of this nonsense.
Yeah, enough
and
of
by
this
the way, the international community, there are people over there who don't want a solution. They've built their careers around it. Some of them are in the United Nations, some of them are in international organisations. Some of those international organisations ought to just get out of the way and let the Palestinians and the Israelis
sort it out for themselves.
Sort it out themselves.
Yeah.
The international interference can be helpful. It can also be dramatically unhelpful.
Hold that thought, and we'll be back in a moment to discuss a little more. Our guest has been Martin Hamilton-Smith. Martin, thanks for coming on. Obviously, we've been talking about your book, which I'm very, very interested, because it's been in my lifetime that this has happened. And it's true, we really don't know what goes on in the corridors of power, as they say. I remember you actually took me through a local Parliament House. I'd never been there before. I had no idea what it looked like inside. We see it now almost every night on the news, and on some channels. The infighting that seems to go on just seems to be such a waste of time, because you made a point earlier in the program how the parties didn't exist when it all began. And just really quickly, can you explain why we ended up with these 2 major parties with a third on the shelf?
Well, the original idea in our constitution was that we'd elect a group of members of parliament. They'd get together after an election and they'd, you know, work out, you know, a government from the majority on the floor, and people would make their own sensible minds up after talking to their people in their local constituencies, etc. It didn't take long for groups to realise that if they ganged up together effectively and formed a party, they could get 50% plus one and run the show. And of course, with that, you then get factions or groups within the groups. So it's quite amusing at times to see the underachievers gather around the bar, say 7 or 8 of them, thinking, look, on merit, none of us have got a hope of getting a ministry, but if we group together as 7 or 8 of us, we can probably elbow, browbeat and force the leader to give 1 or 2 of us a job.
Yep.
People may wonder why occasionally a gobsmackingly silly minister emerges. This is the reason. So these factions emerge. Some of them, you know, are understandable. You know, farmers will group together, workers will group together, professionals might group together. Some of them are quite mischievous though, and they finish up being about personalities, power, and favour, and dividing up the spoils. And that's when, in my view, it gets a little bit toxic. Both parties, by the way, are guilty of this from time to time.
Yes, exactly.
And they both need to improve their efforts, because, as you can see in the electorate, there's a bit of kickback at the moment. People are off the major parties. If they don't look after their relationship with the people, there will be new parties formed, and the old ones will be thrown out.
That's a very interesting prediction. We must talk again soon. Martin, thank you so much. Good
Pleasure.
luck with the book. It's available,
Wakefield Press.
yes, Wakefield Press.
Online. And yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
And until next time, with more information and some fascinating people, please join us then. So until then, keep yourselves nice.